Welcome you all to this panel on building excellence. We've got a terrific panel put together. You're probably expecting 3 panelists. One of our panelists, Joe DeFeo, who is the CEO of Joran Global, formerly the Joran Institute, is unable to be here today. His mother died yesterday. So, we're going to miss Joe, but he would certainly want us to continue, and that's what we're going to do. And I think Harry has got some direct experience with Dr. Joran, so he will be able to provide maybe some commentary that's relevant in that direction. So we're going to operate a little bit differently than the ones you've had the rest of the day, in the sense that we're willing to take questions as we go. We do have some things that we need to pace ourselves through. So if I cut anybody short, please try to forgive my rudeness, but what I'm going to try and do is make sure we get to all of the questions as we go through. But if you have a question to ask, by all means feel free. We have microphones that are set up, and I would ask you to step up to the mic if you have a question to ask, because we're taping everything. Okay? So, without further ado, please let me introduce our panelists to you. So, a man who has been a mentor of mine more than he knows is Dr. Harry Hertz. Harry was the longtime director of the Baldrige Award Program, America's National Quality Award Program, now known as the Baldrige Performance Excellence Program. So he's been with NIST more than 25 years, and he has just been instrumental in my own career. So he's spoken for me on more than one occasion and has always been kind to me. And I think he is a friend to the general community related to quality, to performance excellence, business excellence, operational excellence, organizational excellence. We all know the names. So, Harry Hertz, sitting on your right. Okay. Next to Harry, we have Shaun Barker. Shaun is a new colleague of mine at the Shingo Institute, but I'm the one who's new. Shaun is the one who is probably regarded, I think, as the primary expert on the Shingo model. He's been around it the longest, and I learn from him every day. I think he doesn't recognize maybe how much, because I'm not the best student. But he is terrific, and it's an honor for me to serve with Shaun. Shaun is the Associate Director of the Shingo Institute, and I think has probably been involved in maybe more Shingo assessments than anybody else. He is a very humble man, and I appreciate that about him greatly. So we actually have the topic here, but you've probably seen an overview of what the topic is about. It's about building excellence. So you know, because you live it every day, that organizations are involved in a constantly changing environment. The climate is changing in many directions, and it's not entirely about the sort of performance that you produce that you're used to. You know that we're pushed in social directions and environmental directions, and not purely in terms of operational performance, financial performance, and so on. So we have a lot of challenges. And it's not entirely about excellence. It's additionally about things like being resilient and robust and being sustainable in what we're able to accomplish. So, there are many challenges here, and we have just exactly the right gentleman on stage to address these sort of challenges today. So although Joe is our absent soldier today, I'd like to at least acknowledge him in terms of this slide. So again, his mother died and he's unable to be here today, but he's a terrific man with much direct experience. Most of you will know the quality gurus over the ages. You'll know Dr. Shingo. You'll know about the Baldrige Performance Excellence Award Program, though you may not know much about Malcolm Baldrige, the person, former Secretary of Commerce. So you will know about Dr. Joran almost certainly. So he would be the man familiar with Dr. Joran. So a bit about Joe, and we've talked a bit about Dr. Harry Hertz. Harry's career with NIST has been a very long one, extending more than 30 years now, and he directed the Baldrige program itself for a very long period of time. He was the second director of the Baldrige program. Interestingly enough, you can see his background is in chemistry. And he was, in fact, as the second director, also the second chemist to direct the program. So maybe a bit unlike what you might expect of someone who would direct that program, but for people who are familiar with chemical and process industries, you know. So a good deal about him. Harry has a PhD from MIT, so he is highly, highly qualified, highly experienced, and very skilled at providing expert feedback. And then Shaun, I won't talk much about Shaun, but primarily for one reason, and that's because he is so humble, and he embarrasses easily when people talk positively about him. But I think many of you know who he is. So, one of the first questions we have essentially is, what is the mission and the vision that we have for these organizations? Because we have somewhat different perspectives on performance, organizational, operational excellence, business excellence. So how is it that these organizations, the Shingo Institute, the Baldrige Performance Excellence Program, are attacking this issue, this very challenging and important issue of excellence? And so with that, I'll turn it over to Harry first to discuss the Baldrige perspective, and then to Shaun. And I'm going to go ahead and go, Harry, to your slide.
Okay.
On this.
So
we have a quick definition. Sorry, Harry.
Okay,
we have
go
a
ahead.
quick definition of excellence. That's what we're asking for.
There it is. Okay, thank you. And Rick himself is very kind and humble. I've learned a lot from Rick over the years as well. So maybe it's a little of mutual admiration society. But let me talk a little bit about Baldrige. And Baldrige came about at about the same time as Shingo did. So we have a lot in common. I think we both come out of a history of a time when there was a challenge in a global competitiveness sense, with the United States not performing as well as other countries in terms of quality of our manufactured goods. And that really is the history of the Baldrige program, which was created to develop a mechanism for disseminating a set of criteria that any organization could use to improve its performance, to identifying role model organizations for the United States who were competitive, who were delivering high-quality products, was the focus at that time, although to do was define what we meant by excellence. And that definition has changed some over time, but you see on the slide here the current definition of performance excellence, which I'm sure you will be equally capable or interested in identifying with, whether your interest is Baldrige or Shingo. But basically, it's a threefold definition, starting with saying that it's an integrated approach that results in three things. And the important words there are approach and results. It's about the methods, the processes, the leadership, your approach to achieving it, and then measuring the results, because as you've heard already today, if you aren't achieving the results, all the approaches in the world don't make any difference. In Baldrige, in particular, we say the results should achieve three things. One is to deliver ever-improving value to customers and other stakeholders to ensure organizational sustainability. So that's sort of the outside view, the customer perspective of performing well. The second piece is improving the overall effectiveness and efficiency of the organization. So that's the internal piece of achieving excellence. And actually, in the early days of the Baldrige program, that's where our definition ended. And what we learned from role model organizations very early on is that those organizations had a third key component of achieving performance excellence, and that is that they were committed as an organization to both organizational learning, so to ongoing learning of the organization, as well as a commitment to the ongoing learning of the people of the organization. And over time, we've seen more and more how that last piece is also a key driver of engagement of the people of the organization, which then results in improved results for the organization. So maybe I'll stop there in terms of introduction.
Okay. And for the institute, not dissimilar a lot from Harry's story. I'll talk about it from a model perspective, because that really takes us through the journey of where we've come from. In the beginning, we were looking at organizations through a lens that was quite tool-based and results-oriented, and came to a place in the road, basically, where we looked at organizations and said, why is it that several organizations that we have awarded, several years later, just weren't able to hold it up? There's something missing. There's something missing. We just didn't have the model quite right at that point, and our definition of excellence had also changed. And not dissimilar to what Harry's saying with Baldrige. And this is really where the time came that we began to develop this model and began to look back in the readings of Shingo, and I can remember fondly, mostly fondly, the hours and hours that we spent drilling down in these, because it wasn't done in a vacuum. It was done by the help of a lot of people, although it was Jake, Bob, Randy, and I sitting in this room, and Max came along later to add to it. We used a lot of outside help to do that, and I think that's really important as we look at how this model evolved. So most of what I'll talk about today will revolve around the model, or with the model as the lens of perspective. So hopefully I don't have to do a lot of explaining after I do the definition of how I would define in brief what excellence is. But I would say it's something like this. Excellence is getting the desired results as an outcome of behaviors driven by systems that can sustain not only the results, but the culture that created them. And so if you've seen our model, and I hope you have while you're here, it's unique in the perspective that we have the principles that we talk about, and that we came to understand, because they certainly weren't something that we created. These were principles that were discovered by many other people, not us, but we read about them, we were able to categorize them, and we were able to build a model around them, and to be able to begin to define the behaviors that went around this. And this was very important, because principles that we look at may be different than those that you're accustomed to, because these principles that I'm talking about, they're timeless, they're universal, they're self-evident, and most importantly, they dictate consequences. So once we began to understand how that worked and how those consequences came into being, then it began to really guide us toward a new direction on how we can get great results, sustain those results, now begin to work with organizations with the model. And I say model because we're really careful about not saying it's another program. The last thing you need is another program. This can take whatever program you're using and be able to bolster what you have in it and strengthen it and make it robust, so that you know what behaviors you want to drive by those systems, so that you can get the results that you want. Now, I guess I'll stop there, because I could go on.
Okay. I'm going to skip past point number 2 here, only because we have limited time, and I want to make sure we hit some of the more difficult questions so that we can make our guests squirm. So, How about question number 3? Squirming already, see? How are enterprise excellence, resilience, and robustness related to one another? Or are they, for that matter? Are they synergistic?
So as I looked at this question, I go back to my definition on excellence, and resilience is heavily reliant on the robustness of the systems that I have in the organization. So the more robust my systems, the more resilient my organization becomes, the more able I am to adapt to situations that come up, because we're not going to get rid of those. Right? Everybody has economic situations that happen. Everybody has supplier situations. Everybody has all kinds of things that hit them. Healthcare may have legislation that comes their way. All of these types of things happen. Right? So the question is, how flexible can we be as an organization? And that's what I include in that robustness of the systems, because once you've identified these behaviors that you're trying to drive, then you're able to more focus in on the results you want. We've got to have results. We've just got to have results. The question is, are we as concerned with the results that we're getting as we are with how we're getting them? And I think that's part of it, at the heart of it. So that's how I relate resilience and robustness.
Okay, maybe just before I react to this, just a couple words, because I feel I should, about Jojo Ran and the Joran Institute. And Jojo Ran was one of the guiding lights, actually, in the first set of Baldrige criteria back in the late 80s and early 90s. And if I had to characterize Jojo Ran, I would say that the two things that characterized him were methods and people. That he brought a lot of the same philosophy, tools that Deming brought. Where I found they differed was in the humanity of Jojo Ran. He had an immense respect for people, and he, right from the start, saw key components of quality as being people and customer. So I'd say that's sort of the legacy of Jojo Ran that to this day goes through the Joran Institute. So much for that. In terms of resilience, robustness, and enterprise excellence, in terms of resilience, robustness, I totally agree with everything that Shaun has said. I agree with everything he said in general. I would say that for me, the one further characteristic may be implied, but that I would add in terms of enterprise excellence is proactivity. Very often when one thinks about robust and resilient, they connote in one's mind reactivity. So being robust, being resilient to what's going to happen to you, and enterprise excellence, I think, has a strong component of strategy and proactivity in it, that it's looking at anticipation, not just being resilient or robust to change that's happening to you.
Terrific. Let's move on to the next one then. These will get harder and harder, I think.
Last two, Shaun and I are going to leave to Rick.
And Rick is going to leave to the audience. Okay. So how about this next one? This relates basically to, we talk about continuous improvement, Kaizen. Maybe we talk a little bit less about innovation, although we've certainly heard that term today in some of the presentations and keynotes. And so the first question that we're going to have on this one is, what is the relative importance in your minds of continuous or incremental improvement versus big improvement, breakthrough improvement?
Yeah, if I start this one, if we're alternating, I would say that I wouldn't say one is more important than the other, but what I would say is both are critically important. There is a need to continuously improve, but that alone is not enough. That in a highly competitive environment, in a rapidly changing environment, in an environment where new technologies, competitors are coming from totally unexpected industries as they deliver something not necessarily that competes with what you do head on, but replaces it with something new or different. That in that kind of environment, both continuous improvement of what you do on a daily basis or what you do on an ongoing basis with breakthrough improvement as a partner are critical to survival. And I kind of look at them as continuous improvement being sort of continuing up the slope and getting better and better, and breakthrough improvement being step functions as you go up, so that you aren't just continuously improving, but you're making significant change that leads to discontinuous improvement. And that's sort of how I view breakthrough improvement. And very often, at least we've seen that breakthrough improvement can come from understanding the environment outside your organization, seeing what's going on, understanding what leaders in your area are doing, so benchmarking to some extent, or looking outside your industry to see what might be possible, and then using that for goal setting, realizing that on a continuous improvement curve, you'll never get there. And that's what then starts the brainstorming that leads to breakthrough improvement.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so again, agree with what Harry has said. I might just want to add this piece. I look at them as one necessitates the other in this sense. So if you perform a breakthrough improvement, it's highly unlikely that you're going to get everything right the first time. Mm-hmm. Once you go through pilots, go through launches, go through all kinds of things to prepare yourself, and of course we want to do that, but something happens to this when it actually gets implemented and you go. And that's why I say the breakthrough necessitates the incremental, because then what happens? Well, you begin to incrementally improve to begin to make that the full potential of what you just broke through actually realized. So totally agree with what Harry said. I would just add that, so it's almost like the steps that Harry talked about, yet the overlaying the incremental improvement in between those steps, I guess might be a way of looking at it for that. So yeah, they're both heavily needed.
Okay. Well, let me throw you off kilter a little bit then and ask you this. We live in increasingly competitive times where the pace of change is just accelerating almost beyond belief sometimes. So for organizations that are more in the incremental improvement modes, how is it that they increase the RPM? How do they really rev up the number of iterations or number of turns that they can get in a set amount of time, let's say? Any ideas?
So I think that has a lot to do with as you look at the maturity of an organization, and this is one of the things that we would look at, on a Shingo assessment, is when you look at the maturity of an organization, what capabilities do they have to do that? Are the capabilities in place to do that, to be able to ramp up, as you've said, because you have to have those in place before you can actually turn the switch on, right? Mm-hmm. So I think it's heavily reliant on that. I'm sure there's some other things that Harry will have to say, but that's where I think it lies.
Yeah, I think this sort of is bridging maybe to the next question also, right, on innovation. And I think the way you sort of ramp up the continuous improvement is by the type of environments that encourage innovation. So we look at innovation without getting into details, because I guess that comes next, but innovation having two components to it, or requiring two things. One is a supportive environment, and the second is intelligent risk-taking, where intelligent risk is a risk where the benefit outweighs the risk of not pursuing whatever it is that you've identified as an intelligent risk. And I think the supportive environment is the one that encourages brainstorming, that encourages outside-the-box thinking, that rewards failure. I think one of the biggest downfalls of companies, organizations, is when they encourage risk and then they punish failure. If failure is taken too far after you've identified it as a failure, then you don't want to reward it. But failure, if you're ramping up the RPM and if you're trying new things, there are going to be lots of failures and hopefully some real big successes. You need to recognize those failures for the attempt that the people made and reward those. And I think that's another way of ramping up the RPM. So providing the environment, the encouraging environment for intelligent risk-taking, for brainstorming, for outside-the-box thinking, and then a mechanism for it to happen.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think another thing to look at is making sure that the RPMs that we're ramping them up when we're actually in gear. And what I mean by that is that our alignment is in order, and we've got what we're ramping up, producing those things that we want it, those objectives that we want to achieve, and making sure that all of that is in alignment is highly critical. We may be, as we look at an organization, we may be working real hard and doing many things, but we may not be seeing those results because those may not be the things that need to be done. So we may be ramping up in the wrong area potentially if we don't look at the alignment portion of that. And that's, again, another critical part in the model. And I think Harry addressed the things down in the enablers, but it is critical. The enablers are so critical to this type of environment or risk-taking, as Harry brought up, because my trust in being able to do it and being able to take that risk can be turned off in a heartbeat with one wrong move, one wrong coaching move. It doesn't take a whole lot. Now, as you build that over time, and you build that trust in an individual over time, well, you become more mature and you have more of an ability to say some of the things more directly. But I think it's based, that maturity of the organization, it just continually changes, and it's almost like you have to look at the individuals that you're dealing with very closely to make sure you don't break that trust, because if you do, that's kind of the end of the risk taking.
Yeah. To exercise moderator privilege, because you've talked about essentially things like culture. Whatever words you've used, you've essentially said culture. So everybody's familiar with the quote from Peter Drucker, that father of modern strategic management, that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And in the last session that I was in, they made a play on words for that, and they said that culture eats tools for breakfast. So culture is voracious, and we have a chance to starve the culture or feed the culture. My question to you is, what and how do we feed a culture so that it accomplishes these things that we're after?
Yeah, I think culture has got to start at the top of the organization. Culture is something let me preface that. Every organization has a culture. Most organizations don't have a great culture. And to achieve a great culture and a positive culture requires leadership commitment, and I would say really starts with what we've seen in some of our role model organizations, that everything really stems from the mission, vision, and values of the organization. And probably a leadership that can, and you heard a little bit about that this morning, that can deliver a compelling vision for the organization and values to guide the organization, I think is how you build that culture. And you build that culture also by building trust. And you build trust by the leaders of the organization displaying the values that they have put in place, or that the organization has put in place in their actions day in and day out. Because I think, just like with innovation, or maybe even more so than with innovation, one misstep by leaders that leads to a breach in trust, and the culture is lost. It might take years to gain in an organization that's had a negative culture. It takes 1 minute to lose once it's established by breaking trust. And I like to look at the values of the organization as having a twofold purpose. The first purpose, which is the one that most people think of for the values, is that they're boundary conditions. Mm-hmm. So they're limiting. You must live within these values if you want to be part of our organization. I like to look at values from the other perspective, that values are empowering. They're not boundary conditioned. They are also, but the main use is empowering. So if you want to do something for a customer, for a fellow employee, for the organization, if it doesn't violate the law and it doesn't violate the values of the organization, you are empowered to do it, and you will never get any retribution for taking a risk, for putting your best foot forward to help the organization, the customers, using the values to empower you to do it. And if you use those values, you should never feel uncomfortable in doing what you're doing. Mm-hmm. And that's how you build culture.
Mm-hmm. And I will, of course, relate this back to the model as I look at it. But there's 3 insights that we've learned over this time that we relate to the model. Hopefully, you've heard these sometime before this week or have read them. But we talk about ideal results require ideal behaviors. If we want to get ideal results, we've got to get ideal behaviors, right? Or closer and closer and closer to ideal behavior. If that's what we want to do, then we've got to go back to the systems, because the systems drive that behavior. So we've got to begin to look at those systems and the tools that are enabling those systems, and start to look at how is that driving the behavior that I'm getting out of these, because the behavior, in fact, becomes what? The culture, right? It becomes the culture of the organization. And finally, and probably most difficult, is that principles inform ideal behavior. Now, that seems like a very short phrase, but it's actually a difficult understanding, because what it's talking about is the deeper you understand a principle, the more informed you are about the ideal behaviors that it creates, meaning you can identify them more easily. So the deeper and deeper you get into this principle, the more you'll learn about the ideal behaviors that are necessary to be aligned to those systems. So this is about becoming principle-based. And then back to Harry's comment about leadership, and leaders need to internalize these. Mm-hmm. These aren't something that you can fake, that you can empower down to somebody. You have to internalize them, because if you can't internalize these, it's very difficult to drive them into your organization, to be able to operationalize them, right? So as I look at that, I also look at what level are we engaging everybody in this as we're building the culture. Is it being done by them or done to them? Because engagement takes on a whole different meaning if it's being done to them. So these are some of the things that we look at when we're building that culture. And then culture comes to a new reality, right? It becomes something that's no longer this thing that happens to us, that this is just our culture and, it's how it is. This becomes something that we can predict, right? That we can begin to change through the systems that we build, and we can move closer and closer toward not only the ideal behaviors, but in turn the ideal results that we want also. And that's how, in short, how we look at building a culture of excellence.
Yeah, if I can add one thought to build on Shaun's, one of the things he said was that leaders need to internalize the principles and demonstrate them in their behaviors. A word that I like to use is authenticity. Because if a leader's acting, if a leader feels they're on stage when they're in front of their employees on a day-to-day basis, that's picked up immediately. And I think a key characteristic of culture is leadership as well, and leadership at all levels. Everybody's a leader at some level. Being authentic, share who you are, share what concerns you, be open, be transparent. That's all part of authenticity, and I think that's key in driving culture.
Yeah, absolutely agree. I mean, it's just critical to the mission of building the culture. And I'd like to just add a few more things so we can stay away from the next question. I'm just kidding.
I'll skip ahead.
I'm just kidding.
Okay, but on that note, I will skip ahead. So here we go. This is the tough one, but this is my pet. Okay, so I'm asking them to address my pet questions, or pet concerns at least. So humanity really is faced by some grand global challenges. For example, 40% of deaths worldwide each year are attributed to soil, water, and air contamination. And I could give you a long list of things, but you'd probably be familiar with many of them anyway. A lot of challenges, oftentimes we categorize those into social, economic, and ecological or environmental categories. So my question for our panel members is, what, if any, intersections do you see between the expectations of organizations, or maybe the requirements of organizations, to address social, environmental, and economic considerations?
So I have trouble differentiating between them, for starters. So I don't know that I would talk about the intersection of those three. I guess I would talk more about the intersection of those three and business excellence, or organizational excellence, or performance excellence. And I really believe that an organization cannot achieve excellence today without a commitment to these social considerations. And I can give you lots of examples and lots of, for those who have the green eye shades on, economic incentives for the organization as well, to be good stewards of their social responsibilities. But I thought I would just, knowing this question was coming, share with you a couple of numbers that just impressed me recently. There's an annual trust study of trust internationally, that is conducted by Edgeman. It's called the Edgeman Trust Index. And they just recently came out, I think it's probably a month or two ago now, with their most recent study of, and you can Google Edgeman Trust Index or Trust Study. But here are a couple of numbers, and these deal in particular with employee engagement. And I think everybody here, or else you wouldn't be here, already agrees that customer engagement is an outcome of engaged employees. But some differences in employee engagement between companies that are engaged in societal issues and companies that are not seen as engaged in societal issues. And again, this was a global study. and differences. In terms of employees saying they do the best possible for their customer, 78% said they do in companies who do not focus on social issues. 90% said they do in companies who do focus on social issues. Commitment to achieving the strategy of the organization. Employees of companies not engaged in social issues, 68%. Employees of companies engaged in social issues, 87%. I'll just give you one more. Motivation to perform. So employees' motivation to perform. Companies not engaged, 62%. Companies engaged, 84%. So not only does it make good sense in terms of being good citizens of the communities you're in and the communities you serve, your customer community, but it does lead to financial results, if for no other reason than the engagement of employees who are then committed to your customers. Mm-hmm. And I can give other examples that are not employee engagement related.
Well, I'm sorry that I had Rick skip ahead to the next question. But nonetheless, again, I'll take a principal perspective to how I look at this. And when we talked about principles earlier, I talked about how they informed ideal behaviors. But there's a level below the principle, and we spent, I just can't even tell you how much time working into this, because there are clearly business reasons why we would do some of the things that we do, why we would engage employees, why we would do many of the behaviors that we talk about. But we're talking in a principle-based organization about a level deeper. What are the humanistic things that we do? How do we recognize people, right? How do we recognize the value of people? Excuse me. And so when we look at principles like respect for every individual, this is what begins to hit on the topics that Rick has brought up here. Do we look at each individual with respect by, looking at some of the things that we do from only a business perspective? And if you look at examples of that, actually there was a interesting, when we were working on these principles, there was an interesting press release that came out on a company that was actually measuring the time that their associates walked off of the line to go to the bathroom and how much time it took to come back. And you think, now really? Really, is that what we do? And it's an example of, if you're not principle-based, what do you start to do? You start to come up with rules, policies, legislation, and all of these type of things so that you know that you're taking control of it. When the reality is if, in this case that I talked about, if you respected everyone, would it matter when they want to go? Would it matter how long you took them? Wouldn't you just trust them to be able to do what was needed and come back in an appropriate time? Of course you would, right? So we begin getting down deeper into what we call foundational beliefs, which is the human side of the principle. It goes beyond, well beyond the business belief, and I believe that starts to address some of these topics that Rick has brought up. But it's true, we are facing a lot of them. So let me expand that a little bit. If we're talking about a principle-based organization, then what do we have to become as a state, as a country, as the world? It all still applies. It absolutely all still applies. the principle, as I said, it holds true. It's timeless. It's universal. It holds true. So all we've done is just increase the size of the system that we're talking about, the size of the organization that we're talking about. It doesn't change on whether it works. It may make it more complex in how we have to work it. But could you just imagine in your mind for one moment, because as we also stated, it needs to start at leadership on down. Could you just imagine for a brief moment what a world based on principles would look like? Very, very different. Absolutely very different. And it is different because we know that it is beyond just business needs. And at that point, when we can begin, and sure, we have breakthroughs. This is not to say we don't have breakthroughs, and that because we do. We work toward it in many, many different ways, always moving toward that ideal. But that's the gap. And I think that's what Rick's pointing out is this is a huge gap. We can start dealing with it with businesses. Businesses also have a very large impact on a lot of these things that you're talking about with the social impact and the ecological impact and the economic. Where are we going to be doing business? Well, we're a world economy. I don't think anybody has a doubt about that. So we make those decisions on where we're going to do business. I hope we make those decisions on where we do business based on a principle level decision. I'm not saying we don't. There's long, long debates on this. So anyway, thank you, Rick.
Well, organizations can contribute. Probably most of you know that roughly half of the 100 largest economies in the world are businesses, not nations. So let's see. Do you really think that there's any implication in all of this for either Baldrige or Shingo, for the model in the future, or for the way we assess?
Go ahead.
Okay.
Sorry.
I don't know where we were at. We were bouncing back and forth. But yeah, I think it does. I can see a time as we move the these ideal behaviors forward, which thereby moves our understanding of the principles forward. Yeah, I think we'll look at things like fair labor practices, not only in the businesses that we may be looking at, but what about the supply chains, right? What about upstream and downstream? I mean, where are we getting things from? Do we care about where we're getting things from? Do we, those types of issues? I am sure that they will come into play. Go ahead, Harry.
Yeah, no, I think yes, I think they will play increasing importance. They're there already now, though. If one looks, much like Shaun talked about principles, the Baldrige criteria are based on 11 core values. 3 of those core values are valuing people, societal responsibility, and ethics and transparency. So it's embedded already now in what we ask, what we expect of high-performing organizations, certainly of role model organizations. So I think, yeah, and I think it is a business imperative going forward because people will and are increasingly making decisions on businesses that they will do business with based on how well that organization displays ethical conduct and ethical conduct on a global basis, not just within their facilities, and what they do to contribute to society. And maybe one of my favorite organizations, just by way of example, because they're one of 6 two-time Baldrige Award recipients, is Ritz-Carlton Hotels. They start with a basic credo, and their basic credo is ladies and gentlemen serving ladies and gentlemen. And they believe everyone, and they practice, and their culture demonstrates every one of their employees, whether they're washing sheets in the laundry room or at the highest levels of the corporate leadership are ladies and gentlemen, and they treat them that way so that they will treat their customers as ladies and gentlemen. They also have developed an ability, as many companies have, of building their environmental and their social responsibility into the way they do business, and actually doing business on displaying that responsibility. And just to give you two examples, they have a program called Community Footprints. And Community Footprints means that a certain number of days a year, they have community projects in every community in which they're located, in which their employees go out into the community and provide service to the community. They've now turned that also into a product, in that if you want to, as a hotel guest, they will provide you with the outfit to join a community footprint project and go out into the community with them and basically build their contribution to the community, and you can get some internal reward as well as be part of their interaction with the community. They also have a kids program for kids whose families are staying at the hotel. They've partnered with Cousteau's Oceans Futures Society in their kids program, so if you're part of their kids program, they have fun activities that are based on the Cousteau's Society's Oceans Futures and helping educate the kids today so they will be good citizens and good stewards of the oceans when they become adults. So a couple of examples.
Yeah, so I might just add, so that you don't think that they're not in ours as well. Okay. They are in our enabler section, much as Harry has described. I think, though, we're going to become much more critical of practices, and that as we move forward. I agree with everything Harry's saying. Those are just absolutely great things that they're doing, and we need to continue that. But at some point, that becomes the norm, right? Mm-hmm. At some point, we got to push to the next level, because ideal is still a large gap away from where we're currently at. So, I want to make sure that we're very cognizant of what that ideal might look like, but I'm not sure we're leaving any time for questions.
Okay, well...
I was just going to quickly take it to the other extreme, so you don't think this is just a Ritz-Carlton sort of thing.
Right.
Mighty Fine Burgers, fast food burger place in Texas. They put their sinks for employee hand washing out in the open to make sure, so that customers become part of making sure that their employees wash their hands every time they come from a restroom, and which affects obviously the product that they serve. After customer suggestions, they now opened up those outside sinks to their customers also. And so kids come running in to Mighty Fine with their parents. First thing they do is they run to these sinks because they can wash their hands in the same sinks as the employees wash their hands in. Well, what does that do about contributing to the health of the food that those kids eat then? Mm-hmm. So there are all sorts of things if you're inventive, and it doesn't have to be top of the line to be inventive.
That's right.
And go ahead, Rick. Let's take some.
Well, I was going to say we have a little over 5 minutes, and I am a teacher at Hertz, so please step up to the mic, because if you don't, I will call names. So who's up first?
Sounds like you and I might be on again.
Okay. We have one. You're up.
Hi there. My name is Brad English with 3M. Just a question. We talk a lot about, I'm just going to take this out. There we go. We talk a lot about humanity and being involved in people's life and engagement and stuff like that. And there's typically, sometimes a gap between business and personal life. And what I've noticed in my experience a little bit is that you have to get involved in the employee's personal life a little bit, ask about their family, ask about how their kids are doing, that kind of stuff, in order to really get good engagement and good answers and where you want to go. So my question is, where do you see the gap of business and personal life, if there is one, and if there's been a trend maybe or, something like that as far as personal life and business life getting a little more mixed.
Go ahead.
Well, I would say that there absolutely has been a trend if we just look at social media and what social media has done to this whole kind of personalization of your business life, because it's harder and harder not to see what everybody's involved with, and I personally don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's very dependent on the person and how open they like to be. I know that for years my phone sat right next to two other people in our office. Jake was one of them, and I'll tell you, he knows a lot about my personal life. Probably more than I want him to. But sure, there's a line, there's a fine line. I think many of those lines have probably been legislated to death. But again, if we get back to being principle-based, what does it tell us we should do? What are those behaviors that are appropriate? What are those behaviors that should be coming from us toward our associates? And you can't care about somebody if you don't know about somebody. You can't care about a community unless you know about a community. You can't care about almost anything until you're deeply engaged in it. So I think there definitely is a trend that direction. I just think social media has kind of sped it up a little bit.
Yeah, I'd say that there is more of a blending of personal and business lives driven by commitment to and interest in social responsibility. And I actually think that a key driver, at least initially, of enhanced social responsibility in organizations, in businesses, was the personal drive of people in an organization who felt personal commitment to social responsibility, who want to more and more do good for their communities. And that led to an engagement factor for them. So I think in many cases, the initial impetus for social responsibility on the part of businesses came from the personal interest in their personal lives of the people of the organization. And I think that blending is great.
Yeah, and I think that directly supports what we say in our model about you have to internalize it. If it's not internalized and people don't take it up and take it on and do the right thing because it's the right thing to do, somebody does it somewhere in the organization, and it does. It begins to spread, and other people take it on, but it's got to be internalized first. Mm-hmm. You're not going to get engaged with the cause that you have not internalized.
Okay. Well, I wish we had time for one more question. We don't, but we do have 1 minute, 2 seconds for last words from our panelists. Harry, you're up first.
Okay. I guess my message in 30 seconds would be that whatever you're doing, don't delay. If you don't get engaged in improvement, and you don't start the effort, you'll never start it. And I don't know how many organizations I've heard over the years say, we're not ready yet. We're not ready to use the Baldrige criteria. We're not ready yet to use Shingo. If you're not ready now, you never will be. If you don't get started, you never will start. So I guess my message would be just get started. And I'd challenge you to do that by telling you the Baldrige criteria in 3 questions and encourage you to think about those 3 questions. And the first one is your organization doing as well as it could or should? I think the simple answer to that, everybody would agree, no matter how good it is, no, you're not doing as well as you could or should. 2, how do you know? What are you measuring that allows you to know how well you're doing or should be doing? And 3, based on those measurements, what should you improve or change?
And not dissimilar from what Ari said, because I agree wholeheartedly, is you're going to have to remove some barriers. You know, a lot of people don't even go down this road because, frankly, it's hard. It's really hard. It takes years and years and years. I love to listen to people that go in and visit facilities, and they're just wowed because they're great facilities. And I always like them to know, do you know how long they've been working on this? Maybe 20 years, maybe 25 years. But you've got to remove the barrier at some point. You can't wait until you can influence a leader to do it. You can begin to internalize it. You can begin to understand it. You can begin to develop your own concept around it and begin to spread it, because it still works. It just doesn't work as well as when you have leadership support. And last, but really, really important to me, is it can't be another program. It just can't be another program.
It has to be the way you do your business.
So can you please join me in thanking Harry Hertz and Shaun Barker?